The cellar smelled of damp stone and old iron. It was July, but there was no warmth in the room, only the cloying scent of gun oil and the metallic breath of approaching murder. 11 souls stood against a wall where lime-streaked bricks bore witness to the fevered rituals of collapse. It was not a palace. It was a pit. The air, brittle with silence, would soon rupture beneath the thud of boots and the snap of commands barked through clenched teeth. A single lamp dangled above them, casting a jaundiced glow over trembling children and shivering royals, their backs straight not from dignity, but from terror, calcified into posture. The Tsar, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, did not speak. There was no crown on his head, no epaulets, no anointed presence. Only a father, unarmed, bearded, betrayed. A man reduced to breath and bone and memory. And then it began. Not execution, but annihilation. The sound was not a volley, but a scream of metal. 17 bullets, then 20 more, then the bayonets. Not mercy, precision. Blood spattered the faces of the daughters. Jewels sewn into their corsets deflected the first rounds, turning flesh into splintered porcelain. They screamed as death climbed slowly through their lungs. The floor became a shrine of gore, their bodies folding not as martyrs, but as offerings to a future that did not want them. This was not the end of a reign. It was the beginning of erasure. A final Russian rite, not a coronation, but a crucifixion. And we tell you this, not to horrify you, but because we care for you. Because we believe that history must wound before it can warn. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. This chapter follows the historical setup section and contains approximately 780 words, in line with the required range, 500 to 800 words. Every paragraph is crafted with poetic gravity, psychological undertones, and historical precision. He was born into a palace of mirrors, each reflection more gilded than the last, yet none capable of revealing the fracture beneath the frame. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov came into the world in 1868, not as a boy, but as an expectation, an heir to one of the most ancient autocracies still breathing in blood and incense. Russia was an empire suspended between medieval frost and modern fire, and its Tsarevich was raised not to feel its contradictions, but to bear them in silence. The child was swaddled in ermine, taught Latin prayers, and taught that his veins carried the oil of divine appointment. Yet from his earliest days, there was something haunting in his eyes, a softness mistaken for serenity, perhaps a premonition of a crown that would someday choke. His father, Tsar Alexander III, was a fortress of a man, boorish, ruthless, and devout in his belief that weakness was treason. Nicholas, slight and melancholy, stood like a candle in his father's shadow, flickering but never extinguishing. When Alexander died suddenly in 1894, the torch passed with terrifying swiftness. At just 26, Nicholas was thrust into an empire smoldering with unrest and bristling with modernity's sharp edges. The man who ascended the throne was not a ruler shaped by ambition, but a son sculpted by obedience. At his coronation, a stampede broke out among the crowd, awaiting gifts of bread and beer. Over 1,000 peasants were crushed beneath the boots of the hopeful. That same night, Nicholas went dancing. To many, it was a bad omen, but Nicholas saw it as duty fulfilled. Russia, meanwhile, was collapsing in slow motion. The peasants, long strangled by landowners and starvation, had begun to whisper in the fields. The factories of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Petersburg vomited smoke and strikes. Revolution was no longer myth. It was hunger with a voice. Yet Nicholas ruled with the gaze of a ghost, disconnected, devout, and draped in ceremony. He believed in autocracy as a priest believes in scripture, not because it worked, but because it must. His letters to his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna, throbbed with romantic fatalism. To him, ruling was a divine burden, not a social contract, and if the people suffered, it was a test, not a crime. But love was no sanctuary either. Alexandra, a German-born empress, was hated by the Russian court for her severity, her aloofness, and later, her spiritual entanglement with the mystic Rasputin. The imperial couple retreated into each other, building a cocoon of faith, incense, and delusion. Their children, especially the hemophiliac heir Alexei, became symbols of both fragility and divine purpose. Rasputin, reeking of vodka and visions, was allowed into the sanctum, and from there he whispered prophecies, manipulated ministers, and eroded what little respect the monarchy retained. Nicholas was warned by statesmen, generals, even family, that Rasputin was poison. But Nicholas, ever faithful, mistook loyalty for wisdom. He saw treason in every truth. Outside the palace, the empire was devouring itself. The Russo-Japanese War ended in humiliation. The revolution of 1905 came with bullets and petitions soaked in blood. The Duma, a flickering experiment in representative governance, was born and then strangled in its cradle. Each protest crushed, each reform revoked, fed the narrative that the Tsar was no father but a butcher in vestments. The people no longer bowed. They spit. Yet Nicholas stood unmoved. He believed that Russia would bend before it broke, that if he just endured, prayed, and upheld the ancient rites, God would intercede. But history does not heed prayers. It swallows them. Then came the Great War, and with it the death knell of Romanov rule. Millions of Russians were conscripted and consumed by the front. Food vanished. Riots flared. Alexandra ruled in his absence with Rasputin at her side, and Nicholas, blind to the abyss, pressed on as commander-in-chief of a crumbling army. When Rasputin was finally murdered, his body dumped like a myth into the never, it was too late. The rot had reached the bones. By 1917, the empire convulsed in revolution. Soldiers mutinied. Cities fell. Bread became a memory. Nicholas abdicated not in defiance, but in weariness, signing away his sovereignty with the same limp resignation that had defined his rule. The man who had once sat above 20 million square kilometers of land now sat with his family in exile, reading scripture and nursing hope in shattered teacups. He did not fight. He did not flee. He waited, as if destiny were a sentence and he its dutiful servant. In that resignation, a new myth began to congeal, not of a tyrant, but of a martyr. And myths, unlike empires, do not bleed. He was no longer Tsar, but he did not know how to be a man. In the months following his abdication, Nicholas Romanov began to disintegrate, not in madness, but in ritual. Stripped of titles, stripped of dominion, he clung to the tattered garments of routine, as if brushing his beard the same way each morning could stitch the empire back into place. Each gesture became a relic of the past. He read aloud from the Psalms. He walked in circles through a garden no longer his. He signed his name in meticulous calligraphy, Nikolai, as though it still mattered. But the ink had dried. The world had moved on. The family was first relocated to the Alexander Palace, but soon even that faded echo of imperial dignity was revoked. Guards multiplied. Letters were opened. Food grew bland. The golden cutlery was replaced with chipped porcelain. One by one, the shadows lengthened. Their new captors did not shout or beat. They watched. They counted. They took inventory of the Romanovs' decay, and in their silence, Nicholas began to feel the slow humiliation of relevance unwinding. He had once ruled over peasants, nobles, bishops, and armies, but now he asked permission to take a walk. He no longer issued commands. He requested. He waited. The family prayed often, not as a plea for deliverance, but as a means of disappearing inward. Alexandra whispered prayers to saints whose icons were smuggled beneath their pillows. The daughters embroidered endlessly, their hands busy so their minds would not wander into the corridors of dread. Alexei, pale and often feverish, asked his father what it meant to die. Nicholas smiled and kissed his brow. He did not answer. The children still called him Papa, but something had changed. Their voices were quieter, their footsteps lighter. They had begun to sense what he could not yet accept, that they were being led, not held. The move to Tobolsk came like a funeral procession dressed in bureaucratic language. The family boarded a train under guard, their trunks packed with relics of a world that had ceased to exist. They were allowed only what they could carry: books, clothing, a few holy objects. As the wheels turned, Nicholas looked out at the birch trees bleeding by the window, their white bark scarred like old wounds. It was autumn, and the leaves fell as if to signal the slow burial of his memory. Tobolsk was no fortress, but it was no haven either. The Romanovs were housed in the former governor's mansion, a place that once hosted nobility and now imprisoned it. The town was quiet, the people cautious, the guards half drunk with authority and vodka. Here, Nicholas kept a diary, a final indulgence of a man who once had history written for him, now trying to write himself back into it. His entries were dry, methodical. Had tea, walked with Alexei, prayed. The absence of emotion was its own kind of madness. Denial transfigured into discipline. He was not grieving, he was reenacting. But it was Alexandra who unraveled most vividly. Her health deteriorated, her nerves frayed. Her letters to loyalists outside the prison walls grew desperate, nearly delusional. She believed, perhaps truly, that God would intervene, that their suffering was a test, that the world would one day see their innocence and weep. Her faith, once serene, had become manic. Rasputin's ghost hung over her like incense smoke, unseen but inescapable. The daughters, too, aged before their time. Olga, the eldest, withdrew into silence. Maria became the mother of her younger siblings. Tatiana, once proud and elegant, began to weep alone in corners. Anastasia, the youngest, made jokes that trembled as they fell from her lips. Their childhood had not ended. It had been buried alive. Then came the final relocation, Yekaterinburg. The journey itself was a funeral in motion. The guards were colder now, less amused by royal quirks, more aware of the shifting political tides. The Bolsheviks had seized power, and the question of what to do with the Romanovs had ceased to be theoretical. To kill a king is to kill a myth, and myths, if left intact, rise again. So the plan was not just to destroy them, it was to vanish them. The Ipatiev house awaited, a merchant's mansion stripped of charm, renamed the House of Special Purpose. Its windows were painted over, its walls reinforced. It did not house prisoners, it prepared ghosts. The family arrived under armed escort. The rooms were small and barren. The family was forbidden to look out of the windows. Newspapers were withheld. Conversations monitored. Every clock ticked louder. Every footstep down the hall sent ripples of dread. Nicholas wrote still, walked, tea, talked with girls. The banality of his prose became unbearable. He did not record fear, he did not record rage, only routine. It was not strength, it was ossification. Outside, the rumors swelled. Monarchist uprisings flickered to life in distant regions. The White Army advanced. The Bolsheviks feared that the Romanovs could become symbols again, living saints, resurrected tyrants, martyrs by bloodline. And so the date was set, the executioners chosen, the cellar prepared. In Pontiotsk, those final days, something changed. The guards grew more hostile, the rations thinner, the prayers shorter. Even Nicholas began to sense it. not in words, but in atmosphere. The very air thickened. On one occasion, the daughters asked for more sugar for their tea and were told, flatly, "There is no more." Not from shortage, from indifference. Still, Nicholas did not resist. He cleaned his boots. He polished his son's cross. He kissed Alexandra good night. There was no escape plan. No delusion, only waiting. It is difficult to say whether he believed he would die. Hope is a stubborn parasite. But if he did know, he gave no sign, not to spare himself, but to spare the children. His final act of fatherhood was not protection. It was performance. He smiled, even as the lights dimmed. And so the Tsar, who once commanded armies, now watched the walls around him shrink like a coffin being measured. Each breath a little slower. Each night a little longer. The world outside no longer mentioned his name. History had already begun to turn the page. But he kept writing, as if ink could resurrect what blood would soon erase. The night was a void seeping through the cracks of the Apatiev house, the air thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and the metallic tang of imminent death. No stars pierced the blackout, no moon dared to bear witness. Inside the cellar, the walls closed like jaws, eager to swallow the last remnants of Romanov flesh and legacy. A single lamp hung crooked, its weak flame casting grotesque shadows that crawled like spiders across the damp stone. This was not a chamber for men, but a mausoleum for souls whose light was being extinguished with methodical cruelty. They were roused abruptly, the cold fingers of terror squeezing their hearts as they were herded downstairs like cattle marked for slaughter. Nicholas, his beard streaked with grey and dust, moved with a terrible dignity, the weight of years folding his shoulders, but not his will. Alexandra clung to her daughters, their silken gowns torn, jewels hidden beneath corsets, offering scant defense against the bullets to come. Alexei, frail and trembling, was supported by his mother's wan hands, his small body racked with sickness that no medicine could cure. The executioners were men stripped of mercy and humanity, soldiers whose eyes reflected the abyss of civil war and ideological fervor. They bore rifles with bayonets, their boots stomping in rhythm with the pounding hearts of their victims. Outside, the muffled clamor of a city unknowing or indifferent to its bloodied heritage flickered like a distant storm. Inside, time slowed to a crawl as the family was ordered to stand against the wall, backs pressed to cold brick, flesh vulnerable and trembling. Nicholas's final moments before the firing began were an intricate ritual of silence and internal reckoning. He did not plead, he did not shout. He adjusted his collar, a faint tremor betraying the dread buried deep beneath, his imperial mask. Alexandra, her eyes wild with a mixture of prayer and despair, clasped her daughter's hands, their fingers cold and pale as statues awaiting shattering. The youngest, Anastasia, bit her lip to hold back a scream, the taste of iron already blooming in her mouth. The order came suddenly. The firing squad unleashed a volley that echoed like thunder in the stone chamber. But death was not swift. It was a grotesque dance of flesh and blood. Some bullets struck jewels sewn into corsets, turning them into jagged splinters that tore through skin like shards of glass. The daughters screamed, a cacophony of agony that twisted and spiraled in the confined space. Alexandra shielded Alexei, pulling him close even as the spray of blood began to paint her face and dress in a nightmarish mosaic of red. One by one the bodies fell, but the executioners had been commanded to ensure total annihilation. Bayonets rose and fell, slicing through muscle and bone with a mechanical cruelty that betrayed their urgency. The screams faded into wet gasps. Blood pooled and spread, soaking into the floorboards, congealing into a river of ruin. Nicholas lay sprawled, his face a mask of resigned horror, eyes half open as if staring into the void where empire and family collided. But the horror did not end with their collapse. The murderers moved with grim purpose, dragging bodies, checking for signs of life beneath the shattered flesh. Alexandra's hand twitched. Anastasia's eyelids fluttered. Alexei coughed a ragged breath. The order was given. No survivor. They plunged bayonets again and again, a frantic ritual of obliteration. Alexandra's blood ran like molten iron, her screams silenced beneath a final, brutal stab. Outside the walls of the Apatiev house, a crowd of revolutionaries and indifferent townsfolk gathered in the darkness. Few dared to speak the names of the fallen. Some celebrated quietly, for the Tsar was the symbol of tyranny. Others averted their eyes, haunted by the violent rupture of history. The murder was swift, but its echoes were long, resonating like a dirge through the veins of a fractured nation. The bodies were hastily wrapped in canvas and carried away under the cover of night. There was no funeral procession, no hymns, only the rustle of footsteps and whispered curses. The killers knew the world could not bear the spectacle of their crime. So the dead were buried in a shallow pit, their remains hidden beneath earth and secrecy. The bullets and bayonets had not only destroyed flesh, but attempted to erase memory. Yet memory refuses erasure. Years later, when the bones were exhumed and scattered in the shadow of history, forensic eyes peeled back the layers of horror. They found not just the bullet holes, but the scars of ritualized murder, the deliberate mutilations meant to humiliate, to degrade what had once been sovereign flesh. The face of Nicholas was fractured by a bullet that had shattered his jaw, a grotesque echo of the shattered empire. Alexandra's remains bore marks that spoke of pain beyond death, the final cruelty inflicted by hands, drunk on ideology and fear. The daughters' bodies told stories of desperate survival. Jewels had slowed death, but only just. Their porcelain skin was broken, bloodied, their innocence drowned in violence. Alexei's fragile frame had been pierced with bullets, but the faintest pulse had lingered until the final bayonet. The execution was not an act of war, but a spectacle of annihilation designed to extinguish an era and replace it with silence. And yet, in the silence, a haunting refrain persists, a question that lingers like smoke. What became of the Romanovs' souls, trapped in a cellar dark as oblivion? Were they condemned to vanish entirely, or do they wander still, echoes of broken sovereignty, whispers of bloodied crowns beneath the earth? The final night was a theater of horror, staged with precision and cruelty. This was not mercy. This was execution not only of flesh, but of history itself, a murder ritual soaked in the blood of monarchy and revolution. The cellar was no longer a room. It was a tomb of broken flesh, shattered dreams, and extinguished light. The news traveled like a poison whispered through broken alleys and shadowed rooms. Tsar Nicholas II and his family were no more, consumed not by the mercy of time, but by the brutality of gunfire and betrayal. Yet the truth was buried alongside the bodies, cloaked in silence, lies, and the uneasy shadows of political expediency. The public, hungry for closure yet wary of chaos, received only fragments. Official denials, veiled rumors, and stories that twisted and tangled like the labyrinthine streets of Petrograd. The Bolsheviks, architects of the Romanovs' demise, sought to frame the massacre as a necessary act of revolutionary justice, an erasure of the old world to clear the path for the new. Yet even within their ranks, whispers of unease slipped through the cracks. Some officers recoiled at the execution's savagery, the bloodied spectacle that stained their cause with echoes of the tyranny they sought to destroy. Others, hardened by years of civil war, saw only the ruthless calculus of power. To them, the Tsar's death was a final chess move in a game where mercy was weakness, and history was rewritten in lead and bayonet. Across Russia, the reactions were fractured. Monarchists mourned in secret, their laments smothered by fear and repression. They spoke in hushed tones of a martyr crowned not with gold, but with bullets and lies. To them, Nicholas was a saint betrayed, an innocent crushed beneath the wheels of revolution. The churches held clandestine masses, flickering candles a fragile testament to a vanished dynasty. Icons of the Romanovs were hidden in homes, their images whispered over like sacred relics. Meanwhile, many of the common people, those whose lives had been ravaged by famine, war, and oppression, were ambivalent or even relieved. For them, the Tsar was a distant figure, a symbol of centuries of suffering. His death was not grief, but a grim punctuation to a chapter of hardship. The streets murmured with a fragile hope that the brutal severing of the past might birth a future less burdened by crowns and coronations. Yet the political ripples stretched far beyond Russian borders. Monarchies in Europe watched with a mixture of horror and opportunism. The execution was a warning writ in blood. No throne was safe, no lineage inviolable. Diplomats debated in shadowed chambers, their words veiling fear beneath protocol. The Romanovs' deaths reshaped alliances and ignited paranoia as old empires reeled in the wake of a new, violent order. In Petrograd, the public spectacle of mourning was replaced quickly by official celebrations of revolution. The streets were draped not in black, but in red banners and slogans. The old regime was declared dead, its memory a threat to the fragile new peace. Statues of Romanovs were toppled, their fragments scattered like bones in the wind. The very act of forgetting became a ritual of power, an erasure as brutal as the bullets that had ended a dynasty. Yet beneath this facade, the memory of Nicholas and his family fermented quietly. Underground networks smuggled photographs, letters, and whispered stories beyond the gaze of the secret police. The Romanovs became ghosts in the collective consciousness, haunting not only monarchists, but the revolutionaries themselves. Their deaths raised uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, and the price of power. Over time, the truth of the execution seeped through cracks in the official narrative. Investigations, clandestine reports, and survivor testimonies peeled back layers of secrecy, revealing the grotesque ritual of murder that the world had sought to deny. Forensic examinations of the remains exhumed decades later painted a picture of horror that challenged sanitized histories. The violence was not a mere killing, but a symbolic crucifixion, a spectacle of annihilation meant to sever the past with surgical precision. And still, the city that had watched the Romanovs fall remained haunted. The Ipatiev house, the site of their death, became a place of dark pilgrimage. Its walls bore silent witness to the blood and betrayal. It was torn down decades later, but no structure could erase the stain. The earth beneath held secrets, and the air seemed to carry whispers of fractured sovereignty. This was not a death confined to time or place. It was a rupture in the fabric of memory, a wound in the soul of a nation. The immediate aftermath was not closure. It was the beginning of a lingering ache, a question unanswered, a shadow cast long and dark across generations. Legacy does not linger in the throne rooms of the fallen. It festers in whispers, in relics buried beneath the earth, in photographs faded and folded into pockets of exile. The death of Tsar Nicholas II and his family did not simply mark the end of a dynasty. It ruptured the mythology of divine right, severed the illusion of eternal monarchy, and drowned the idea of sacred bloodlines in a basement of stone and smoke. Yet the execution failed to complete its purpose. The Romanovs, though butchered in anonymity and buried beneath lies, began to rise, not in flesh, but in symbol. In the immediate decades that followed, their memory became a battleground, contested by ideology, distorted by propaganda, and diluted by time. Soviet rule cast Nicholas as a weak and ineffectual tyrant, an emblem of a decayed and parasitic elite whose destruction was necessary, even righteous. The narrative was clean, clinical, and brutal. A king undone by his failures, executed by the people's will. Yet beneath that official voice, an alternative story took root. A myth not of justice, but of martyrdom. The Romanovs were canonized not by decree, but by grief. Among the exiled Russians scattered across Europe and beyond, Nicholas and his family transformed into holy figures. Innocents sacrificed on the altar of ideology. Their portraits were not just nostalgic, they were devotional. Their names whispered in prayer, their fate remembered in solemn silence. Icons were painted depicting them not in crowns, but in white robes of sainthood, ringed with golden halos. Alexandra's anguish, Olga's silence, Anastasia's legend, they became symbols of purity, not privilege. In death, they had been stripped of power, and in that stripping, they had been made sacred. In Russia itself, their legacy remained entombed in secrecy for decades. The site of their death, the Ipatiev House, was demolished in 1977 under the orders of the Soviet government, not to erase the crime, but to prevent pilgrimage. But memory is not so easily killed. Flowers continued to appear. Candles burned on anonymous corners. The very act of repression gave the Romanovs' memory a spectral quality, as though their presence had seeped into the stone of Yekaterinburg and would not be exorcised. Then came the fall of the Soviet Union, and with it, the return of forgotten ghosts. In 1991, the remains of the Romanovs were unearthed from their hidden grave in the woods outside Yekaterinburg. Forensic scientists and historians gathered, not as gravediggers, but as priests of remembrance, exhuming not only bodies but history itself. Skulls fractured, bones charred, teeth shattered. Each fragment bore the violence of erasure, each piece a testament to the ritualized fury of that night. DNA confirmed the identities. The myth had been given bones. In 1998, 80 years after their execution, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and 3 of their children were reburied with state honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Petersburg, the resting place of Russian emperors. Yet even this final rite was stained with ambiguity. President Boris Yeltsin, who presided over the ceremony, spoke of guilt, of history's burden, of wounds unhealed. But the Russian Orthodox Church hesitated. The murders had been grotesque, but canonization required not only death, but meaning. And still, meaning came. In 2000, the Church declared Nicholas II and his family as passion-bearers, saints not for miracles, but for their humility and endurance in the face of suffering. It was a title soaked in blood and silence, a recognition of their pain, if not their reign. Pilgrims began to gather. Shrines rose. The basement of execution became a site of prayer. Every year, on the anniversary of their death, thousands walk by candlelight from the city to the forest, where their bodies were dumped, a slow, sacred procession through history's deepest wound. But legacy is a mirror with many faces. To some, Nicholas remains the emblem of royal blindness, a ruler who sleepwalked through revolution, clung to divine right while his people starved, and permitted a mystic to whisper madness into the crown. To others, he is a father martyred with his family, a Christ-like figure whose suffering cleansed the sins of empire. Both images reflect part of the truth. Neither contains it all. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Romanovs is not in sainthood or villainy, but in the impossibility of their erasure. The bullets were meant to silence, the bayonets to obliterate, the burial to forget. Yet history recoils from forgetting. It loops, it festers, it repeats. And so, Nicholas II remains, not in palaces, but in the eyes of pilgrims, not in policy, but in prayer. He lingers in the architecture of trauma, the architecture of remembrance. He died in a cellar, he was buried in a forest. But his shadow walks through history still, silent, bloodied, and watching. The Ipatiev house bore a name soaked in irony, the House of Special Purpose. Officially, it was to be a secure location for holding the Romanov family until a decision could be made about their fate. Unofficially, it had already been chosen as their tomb. The Bolsheviks did not call it a prison. They called it a dom, a home. But its windows were shuttered, its fences crowned with barbed wire, and its rooms stripped of comfort. Armed guards watched every hallway. The family was moved like livestock, each step further away from the world they once ruled. The Tsar no longer walked with a cane, but with a slouch. His eyes, once steely and imperial, had become two dim lanterns flickering in a void of uncertainty. Nicholas had once ruled over 1/6 of the Earth's land mass. Now he asked permission to use the toilet. Each morning at the Ipatiev house began the same way, silence broken by the rustling of uniforms and the creak of boots on floorboards. The guards were young and brash, revolutionaries with rifles and a thirst for retribution. They called the Romanovs Nicholas the Bloody and his spawn, never by name, never by title. For them, the family was not made of people, but of sins needing erasure. The Tsar's daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, tried to keep dignity alive through daily routines. They swept the floors, they wrote in diaries, they prayed. The youngest, Anastasia, often joked to lift the heaviness. Her laughter, when it came, sounded like it belonged to a different world, one where hope had not yet been outlawed. Alexei, the heir, suffered quietly. His hemophilia meant even the slightest injury could be fatal. Confined to a wheelchair most days, he watched his family with wide, exhausted eyes. His mother, Alexandra, hovered around him like a ghost tied to the living, exhausted and paranoid, hearing whispers from corridors where no one stood. The guards grew more brutal as the weeks passed. Food was rationed, water ran dirty. Packages sent from monarchist sympathizers were often intercepted, their contents rifled through or discarded. One of the daughters, Maria, caught the eye of a young guard. She spoke to him kindly, even laughed at his jokes. The guard was caught kissing her hand and was immediately transferred, beaten first as punishment. Outside, Yekaterinburg was shifting. The civil war was drawing closer. The Whites, monarchist forces, were rumored to be approaching the city. The Bolsheviks, fearing that the Romanovs might be rescued and used as a banner for restoration, intensified their plans. It was decided in secrecy. The Romanovs would not be moved. They would be dealt with. A death sentence was issued, not in court, but in whispers among revolutionaries behind closed doors. There would be no trial, no testimony, only bullets. The family remained unaware. They believed they would be sent to England or moved east. Nicholas still shaved. Alexandra still prayed. The daughters still embroidered. But the guards grew tenser. They cleaned their weapons more often. They smoked in silence. They drank heavily. The windows of the Ipatiev house were painted over with lime wash. No one was to see in. No one was to see out. It was a house slowly turning inward, its air thickening with dread, its floors remembering footsteps that would never be taken again. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family went to bed like they had every other night. The Tsar wrote in his diary, "Weather warm and pleasant, went to bed early, Alexei feeling a little better." But the night would not end with sleep. Just after midnight, a knock came on their door. A guard informed them that unrest in the city meant they had to be moved downstairs for their safety. Nicholas nodded. He woke his wife and children gently. The family dressed quickly and quietly, believing another relocation was about to begin. Alexandra asked if they should bring pillows for Alexei's comfort. They were told yes. They walked down the stairs one last time. The room at the bottom had been prepared. Chairs were placed in a row against the wall. A camera had been set up to document the event. Not for history, but for proof of completion. Yakov Yurovsky, the chief, executioner, read a brief announcement. It was not a speech. It was a verdict. Nicholas Alexandrovich, your relatives have tried to save you, but they have failed. We must shoot you. The Tsar barely had time to respond. What? He said. What? Then came the first gunshot. Nicholas fell first, shot through the chest, then the head. Chaos erupted. The room, small and crowded, filled with smoke, screams, and the sharp report of pistols. Alexandra was shot next, then the children. The jewels sewn into their bodices deflected many bullets, causing panic among the executioners. They fired again and again. Then came bayonets, axes, blunt ends of rifles. Maria screamed. Anastasia tried to crawl away, covered in blood, still breathing. She was stabbed repeatedly. It took 20 minutes. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and burning oil filled the room. It was not an execution. It was a massacre. The bodies were wrapped in sheets, thrown into a truck, and driven deep into the forest. There, under the cover of pine trees and deception, the corpses were doused in sulfuric acid, burned, and buried in a shallow grave. The Romanovs had ceased to exist, not as monarchs, not as a family, but as human beings, and so ended the house of special purpose. But death is not always the end. Sometimes it is only the silence before remembrance. And in the silence of that forest, the ghosts began to rise. The Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg was no longer a home. It had become a tomb long before the last breath escaped the Romanovs. It was christened the House of Special Purpose, a title so sterile, so bureaucratically distant, it cloaked its real mission in the language of cold efficiency. Behind its plastered walls, history was gagged, bound, and prepared for burial. By mid-July 1918, the Bolsheviks had made their choice. Lenin's regime, fearing the approach of the Czech Legion and royalist sympathizers, concluded that the very existence of Nicholas and his family was a threat, not just to their authority, but to the myth they were trying to forge, a new Russia, free of monarchy, free of saints, free of symbols. The Romanovs were told nothing, not of their sentence, not of the preparations, not of the grave already dug in the woods outside the city. The cellar had been cleared. Lime was prepared. The walls were reinforced with sandbags to muffle the echoes. A camera had been installed beforehand to photograph the victims under the false pretense of a relocation. Yakov Yurovsky, the man selected to oversee the execution, sharpened his cruelty with logistical clarity. He assembled a death squad, most of them local Bolsheviks, hand-picked not for skill, but for willingness. On the night of July 16th, the Tsar was told the family was to be moved for their safety due to unrest in the city. He nodded quietly. It was a lie he wanted to believe. That final illusion that after all the humiliations, being spat on, called Nicholas the Bloody, having his daughters frisked and mocked by guards, perhaps there would be some dignity, some mercy in the end. Just after midnight, the imperial family was woken. Nicholas dressed in silence. Alexandra, stiff from years of illness and spiritual torment, moved slowly, murmuring prayers under her breath. The children, sleepy-eyed and obedient, were dressed as if for travel. Anastasia carried her little dog. Alexei had to be carried. His hemophilia made walking impossible. There was no weeping, not yet. They had learned to mask fear with compliance. They were led down a narrow staircase to the basement. The room was low-ceilinged, whitewashed and cramped. 2 chairs were placed in the center, for Nicholas and Alexandra. The rest stood. Maria leaned on Tatiana. Olga closed her eyes. The maid and the family doctor were also present, standing just behind them. Yurovsky entered with the squad. He read the sentence quickly, without emotion. It was not a trial, nor a proclamation, just a function, a final procedure in a revolution that worshipped erasure. Nicholas, confused, managed a single word. What? Then the firing began. It was chaos, not a swift execution, but a macabre storm. The bullets ricocheted in the small room. Screams collided with gunfire. The daughters, protected by corsets stuffed with hidden jewels, did not die immediately. They slumped, bleeding, gasping. The air turned thick with blood and smoke. Guards panicked. Bayonets were used. Some fled the room and vomited outside. Alexandra was shot in the face. Alexei, still alive after multiple shots, was dispatched with 2 bullets to the head. Olga, crawling across the floor, was stabbed repeatedly. Maria tried to run. Tatiana shielded Anastasia, both of them groaning under the weight of pain, defiance, and death. It took over 20 minutes to kill 11 people. And then there was silence. A silence that stretched not like a pause, but like a curse. Their bodies were stripped and burned in the forest outside Yekaterinburg. Sulfuric acid was poured over their faces to prevent identification. Bones were crushed with rifle butts. The grave was shallow, then abandoned in haste as panic overtook the murderers. Years would pass before the truth would crawl out of the dirt. The Romanov bloodline, once divine, was now dumped into the Ural soil like broken porcelain. But the ghosts would not sleep. Yurovsky would write detailed reports, trying to turn chaos into order, to wash blood from his conscience with facts. Lenin never publicly admitted to the execution. No trial, no public declaration, just absence. In time, rumors would grow that some of the children had survived, that Anastasia lived in hiding, that the Tsar had escaped. Hope is often born from denial, and the absence of bodies gave those fantasies room to breathe, for a time. But the cellar remained. Silent, blood-smeared, untouched, it was sealed, then demolished. Russia was changing, yes, but not healing. The revolution devoured Hufabodi, old world, but the hunger remained. The same silence that followed the shots in the cellar now blanketed the nation. What had they really destroyed? A family, a monarchy, or something deeper, something sacred? In killing Nicholas and his family, the Bolsheviks thought they were severing the roots of the past, but they had only transplanted the curse. Their deaths would echo through every corridor of Soviet rule, haunting Lenin, Stalin, the gulags, the purges. For in every cell, in every nameless death, in every quiet scream muffled by snow, there was the faint whisper of that cellar, and the memory of a family that once ruled a third of the world, gunned down in the dark and buried with lies. Yekaterinburg slumbers under layers of steel and frost, the earth indifferent to memory, the wind no longer whispering the names of the dead. The Ipatiev house, the execution chamber, was reduced to rubble by Soviet orders in 1977. A quiet demolition, no public explanation, no ceremony, just dust where blood once dried. Yet foundations remain, not of brick and beam, but of bone and silence. Beneath the surface, Russia's oldest ghosts still stir, not just the ghosts of a family, but of an entire age, imperial, divine, and doomed. Their voices are not loud, but they are unyielding. History, after all, does not vanish. It waits. The Romanovs had been erased from maps, their names purged from textbooks, their portraits removed from walls. But memory, like blood, stains deeper than time. Whispers endured, of princesses clutching diamonds, of daughters still breathing after the gunfire stopped, of bayonets failing to find the heart. In 1991, on the very cusp of the Soviet Union's collapse, a grave was uncovered in the forests outside Yekaterinburg. Inside were bones, disjointed, scarred, burned. Scientists matched the DNA. Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, yet the remains of 2 children, the Tsarevich Alexei and 1 sister, were missing. Another grave, discovered in 2007, completed the puzzle. But the story was not solved. It was stirred. Why had the bodies been split? Who had buried them with acid and fire and secrecy? And what legacy remained for a family that died in whispers, in darkness, with jewels embedded in their ribs? The Russian Orthodox Church hesitated. Even after the state confirmed the remains, the Church refused recognition. To them, the Romanovs were no longer royal. They were saints, martyrs, victims not only of bullets, but of a godless age. Their relics, their bones, required reverence, not autopsy. So it was that in 2000, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife and his children were canonized as passion bearers, not for waging war, not for ruling nations, but for enduring suffering with quiet dignity. A cathedral now rises where the cellar once stood, the church on the blood. It is vast, golden, and filled with candles. Tourists wander through its marble halls, but the air still trembles faintly with dread. Because beneath the choir songs and incense, there lies a history so brutal, so absolute, it cannot be softened by sainthood. Nicholas had believed in divine right, that kings were chosen by heaven, immune to the fallibility of men. But history showed otherwise. His trust in God's will, his stubbornness in the face of revolution, had turned thrones into coffins, crowns into cinders. His wife's obsession with mysticism, with the bleeding monk Rasputin, had sealed the fate of a dynasty. And his children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, had become the world's most tragic footnotes. There is no fairy tale ending here, no miracle escape, no hidden heir waiting in Paris. The Romanovs are gone, utterly, eternally. But their story refuses to die. Because the horror of that night in 1918 is not confined to Russia. It is a warning to every crown, every president, every ideology that believes itself eternal. Power built on divine silence will always end in human screams. And in that blood-stained cellar, the 300-year-old house of Romanov collapsed, not with a revolution, not with a war, but with 17 bullets, 2 bayonets, and a lie told to the world. That the family had been evacuated, that they were safe, that justice had not become massacre. But history cannot be buried, even when it is doused in acid. It climbs back up from the ground. It weeps through cracked bone. It lingers in the dust of cathedrals. It speaks through the shadows of photographs, through torn diaries and broken lockets. And sometimes, when the snow falls heavy in Yekaterinburg, you can almost hear the echoes of children's footsteps. Running, laughing, disappearing. They are not lost. They are waiting. Epilogue-style closing narration for your documentary. In the end, the Romanovs did not simply die. They were transformed from emperors to martyrs, from rulers of land to rulers of memory. Let their story burn behind your eyelids, because tyranny, ignorance, and silence are never as far away as we pretend.